speak English because the first purpose of the course is practice in English language. But it's not simply practicing the language, because my purpose is to show that the discussion of words and their meaning and interpretation in English has and does constitute philosophy. That is, by simply talking about the meaning of words, we are doing my understanding of the term philosophy. Firstly, let me say that I speak, I am told that I speak clear English. I, of course, speak with a typical middle-class, educated, southern English accent, but it's clear. I hope. If certain expressions I use or phrases I use are not clear, please say I can try and find other words in English. I will talk not for more than an hour. I think it is difficult to concentrate in another language for that time. But we can have as much discussion as you wish, or not. You're free. In this respect, we are free. There are 8 lectures ending on the 18th of December. There is no lecture on the 20th of November, which is a holiday. And we are making a recording of the lectures to be put onto the Institute site so that they are then available for student or other people's use. Closer to the microphone. Thank you for telling me. Is this better? Is this better now? Okay. So firstly, the purpose, practice in listening and usage of philosophical discussion in English. And I particularly want to talk about certain words or concepts which cause special difficulty for Russian speakers. And one of these words is the very simple word science, which I will talk about today. The second purpose, as I've said, is my title is about not just about the definition of words, it's about the interpretation of words. It is my philosophical stance that words do not have final definitions. They are always contextual, always have to be interpreted, and this is particularly the case with philosophical words, where the subject matter that the words describes is an attempt to reach the boundaries of what we can understand about the world, and to ask questions about how it is possible to understand in the first place, what constitutes understanding. And my interest and expertise, if I have expertise, is in the history of concepts and of ideas. And I'm not going to argue the case now, but for me, and in my understanding, doing the history of thought is an engagement with what thought has been, and that is it. The history is not the study of simply, in some sense, facts from the past or the past. It is a dialogue with what people have understood. And in my understanding, that dialogue is the richest that we have. That is, we cannot afford not to do history, because there we find the richest resources that we have for enlarging our thinking. This is my personal position. And I think that the problems of interpretation are very much like the problems of translation. I'm not going to talk about translation and its technical problems, it's not my specialism, but you may well wish to do so in comments, because of course your attempts to translate the words that I use, or the phrases that I use from English to Russian, will present you with problems of interpretation. That is, by listening you engage in hermeneutics. Now I have to make one reservation, and it's obvious, but what I know about is Western and modern. And I'm not going to pretend to enter into other cultures which I do not know about. I think it better for me to stay with what I do know about. And I hope that this is a mark of respect for other cultures, not a matter of ignoring them. But were I to make comments about non-Western and ancient cultures, they would be cliches or not very informative. It's better for me to talk about something I know about. That's my view. But of course, you may well wish to take me into other areas. Well, the first lecture then is about science. And it followed next week by a related lecture on what would now commonly be called in Western universities the humanities. There's commonly a contrast between science and humanities in the English-speaking world. Today I explain the usages of science, next week the usages of the word humanities. But clearly there is an important relationship. So in a sense, I continue with what I'm saying today next week. Now I will start with the dictionary, with the O. There's a sheet, by the way, which I've circulated. If any of you do not have the sheet, it has please take a copy. You can see there's a sheet, and it contains notes on what I'm saying, along with what I think is most useful is the spelling of people's names. I'm completely unable in the foreign language to hear people's names. I'm just back from Armenia, and there I lived in a tuman, in a fog of naming. Anyway, the information is on the sheet for your usage. I don't use PowerPoint. I use a sheet of paper. And you may or may not like that. Now, we turn to the Oxford English Dictionary, known to everybody as the OED. And we find that there are several definitions given. The first is simply that science is knowledge. Fact, in general. And of course that leaves completely open the question of what is knowledge. The second definition is one that is no longer much used, but you can talk about a science as an acquired skill. Like there's the science of boxing, or the science of horsemanship, knowing how to ride a horse. This used to be common usage. It's not now. A third definition, and this is much more relevant, you're familiar with. A science is simply a particular branch of study. Physics, chemistry, philology. And hence you can ask questions like, is psychology a science? That is, it does. Is it the kind of study that corresponds to what we understand by science? And the last definition is an interesting one. And this is equivalent to the medieval Latin usage of scientia. The scientia passes from medieval French into English during the Middle Ages. And what differentiates scientia from the first definition of knowledge in general is that scientia is formally ordered knowledge with a claim to be demonstrated truth. That is, that built into the usage of the word science is a whole set of claims or allusions or references to truth. And this is, of course, very important to its history of the word and the way it's used. And so I want to, and in this sense, scientia is very much like the German word Wissenschaft. And German notions of Wissenschaft have been notable for their attempts to show that a body of knowledge is systematically grounded in certain fundamental logical principles of reason itself. Whereas English language forms of showing demonstrated truth have, since the early modern period, since the 17th century, been dominated not by formal logical criteria, of course, but by criteria of correspondence. Does a statement correspond to what is known about the world? And this is famous as a division between rationalism and empiricism. But it's important to note that from the 17th century, at least onwards, there is this separation between the emphasis, where the emphasis lies in showing that something is formally constituted as a science. Does it involve criteria of rationality? Does it involve criteria of empirical correspondence? Now let me quote, as I do on the sheet, from the OED, because I think it's an interesting, very good definition in the dictionary. This is the definition of knowledge of science that matters to us. It is, I'll read it and then I'll break it down into parts. I'm going to read the whole sentence, it's quite complicated. Then I'll show that there are three parts to this sentence. Science is a branch of study which, one, is concerned either with a connected body of demonstrated truths, or two, with observed facts systematically classified and more or less colligated, I'll explain this, more or less colligated by being brought under general laws. And three, which includes trustworthy methods for the discovery of new truth within its own domain. Three elements to this. Firstly, it's a body concerned with demonstrated truths. A reference to rationalism is grounded in some fundamental principles shown to be logically deducible from them. Or, secondly, it's concerned with observed facts, collected systematically and arranged so that they show us general laws about the world. This is a reference to the English language tradition of establishing science. And in the definition, it uses the word colligated, which is a technical word. You won't know it. Most English speakers would not know it. It in origin means bound together. To colligate is to bind. To bind. And it was introduced into philosophy by John Stuart Mill in his Logic in 1843. To suggest that a science can be formed not by grounding it on formal logical principles, but by arranging facts so that they demonstrate laws which hold about the world, the universe. And there is and just after Mill published, there was the classic example of establishing science by the colligation of facts, assembling them into order, which was Darwin's theory of evolution. That is, it's not an argument founded on first principles. It's an argument which shows that if you put all what we know about the biological world together, there is only one kind of explanation which is adequate for explaining these facts. He colligated the facts of the biological world. Note how this definition raises questions about people say, well, is it proved? Lots of science is not proved like deduction. In mathematics proves something. Lots of science is not demonstrated that way. It's established by the colligation of facts. And thirdly, in this definition, a science contains methods or ways for discovering new truth. And this, of course, has been historically important to the rise of the status of science. Why has science taken such a prestigious position in the world? It's because it appears, ways to advance, to make progress, to uncover new truth. When people talk about the establishment of science on fundamental principles, they usually historically trace it back to Aristotle's posterior analytics. This is the classic source for the argument that you must, to establish demonstrating knowledge, turn to demonstrating forms of argument of the kind that Aristotle laid out. So that's the classic reference. And of course, deeply influential through into the modern period. Right. Is this clear? Am I too fast? Is it too fast? Sometimes too fast. And is the language clear, or are there things that I should explain? Oh. I mean, I have to rely on what you say. I can't imagine inside your own minds. Thank you for telling me that. It's sometimes too easy. Now, let me turn from these definitions to the history. So I move to the second section, history. In the Middle Ages, all systematic forms of knowledge, all those which claim to be founded on first principles, are sciences. Of course, including theology. Indeed, theology is sometimes called the queen of the sciences. Note how interesting this is for modern English usage, that the queen of the sciences is theology. And theology, of course, had the status as the superior science within the teaching world of the medieval university. It was the senior faculty. Things begin to change in the late Renaissance and early modern period. English language historians use the phrase early modern to refer to a period from about the 17th century into the beginning of the 18th century. And of course it's helpful if you know English history, the figures. It's not so helpful in other countries. But you can see the change in two of the most famous books that use the word science in their titles from this period. First, Descartes. And I use the English translation of the discourse of the method of rightly understanding one's reason and reaching truth in the sciences. Discourse on the method of rightly conducting one's reason and reaching truth in the sciences. And Descartes' method is about certain sciences, as we would understand it. It is not about theology. That is what we see evidence from the 17th century of a separation between the notion of theological discourse and a scientific discourse. My second example is from Giambattista Vico, who, the Italian Napolese scholar, who in 1725 first publishes his La Scienza Nuova, the new science. What is this new science? It's, of course, the science founded in his historical understanding of the development of human languages. Completely different understanding of what science is from Descartes. He doesn't talk about a new science, he talks about the new science. Just Descartes was equally sure that the new science must be founded in mathematical physics. And Vico is equally sure it has to be founded in the history of languages. That is, by the early 18th century, we have a separation of different conceptions of science. And both these conceptions are separate from theological argument. Both Descartes and Vico try, to a certain extent, to keep their distance from theology. Well, that has to be qualified, but perhaps it's clear. Now, in English, then during the course of the 18th century, the branches of knowledge which are taught in universities are usually not called sciences, but are divided into two forms of philosophy: natural philosophy and moral philosophy. And there's a similar division in French between the physique et la morale. That is, already by the mid-18th century, instead of people talking about a universal science, they're not talking about science, they're talking about divergent branches of philosophy. Moral and natural. And the most famous example of natural philosophy is, of course, Newton's great work of 1687, which is entitled in Latin, The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. Not of science. And the most read English language text in moral philosophy in the 18th century, because it was given to students as the text to educate them into moral, to make men, we're talking about men, make them gentlemen, was the sermons of Joseph Butler, who later became Bishop of Durham. His sermons date from the mid-18th century. Very influential. And he refers to moral philosophy, and by the time that his sermons are being taught in the 19th century, they are often called moral science. Indeed, the faculty that I studied at in Cambridge in the late 1960s was the faculty of moral science. Interesting. Historical fossil from earlier ages. Now, before I move on with this, just three brief comments about three other words. Firstly, natural history. These words are very common in English. And that natural history is particularly associated with the arguments of Francis Bacon, and the belief that it is possible through the collection of facts, observations, to create a science, simply by assembling the facts. And many people in the 18th century, instead of doing science, wrote what they called natural histories. But the modern usage of natural history is to refer to people who are naturalists and study plants and animals in nature. And there is a connotation, an association with natural history, that you're not a real scientist, but something of an amateur in modern usage. Though, if one wished to describe Darwin, I think much the best description would be that he was a naturalist. And of course it raises the question, which has been discussed and answered within the English-speaking world, whether it's possible simply by collecting facts to make a science. And the answer is, of course, no. If you just collect facts, you have a mess. You have to order them, you have to select, you have to arrange. And the way you select, order, and arrange involves choices, and those choices reflect and include theories. And then you're in the argument of what justifies the theories that you apply to the ordering of facts. So you're back with the argument, what are the foundations? Even if you do natural history. The second word, and this is difficult but very interesting, is conscience. Common science. One word, conscience. And conscience comes into usage to describe truth, which is not proved by logical argument, but is proved by moral argument. It's interesting. It's proved not by deduction from principles. It's not like Euclidean geometry or Cartesian mechanics, but conscience is what we know to be true because of the moral truths that we possess as human beings. And so that Joseph Butler, writing his sermons, is writing about the truths of the conscience. And for him, and for those who followed his way of thinking, the conscience was a source of truth, as secure, if not more secure, because it's founded on God, the Bible, than the truths of the demonstrated sciences of the kind that you find in the physical sciences. So the conscience then transfers into use for the moral sense. It's the inward light that a person has, that certain things are or are not morally acceptable. In England, the conscience was powerfully influential with the Puritans, with the radical Protestant sects. And of course, the conscience has been powerfully influential among the radical Russian sects. That is, that they have turned to an inward truth, or a truth based upon their reading of the Bible, rather than the truths of the established church or churches. Conscience. My father was extremely preoccupied with his conscience. During the Second World War, my father was a pacifist because of the moral certainty that he possessed that it was wrong, absolutely, to kill. That is, his truth was not a demonstrated one, but for him it was a moral certainty. And of course, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky are full of discussions of what constitutes this kind of moral truth or conviction. But it's interesting that it shares its roots with science. The third word that I just want to mention is the word scientific, which of course is used all the time in English. Something is described as scientific or not. Is it scientific, people will say. Is it scientific? Well, what do they mean? Normally what they mean is simply, do people agree that it's the best knowledge that science has? It's a social definition. Is it what people agree that certain things are science and certain things not? But of course, properly, the word scientific is traced back to the arguments of the posterior analytics, in which you have to fulfill certain conditions for something to be demonstrated. And if something is demonstrated that it is scientific, if it's not, then it's not scientific. But of course, how to decide which is and which isn't scientific is profoundly debated over the centuries, where to draw the division. Astrology. I know an astrologer who's perfectly persuaded that it's scientific. Most people say not. Jacques Lacan in Paris advanced his psychoanalytic theories as science, without qualification. To most English speakers, that's just a joke. Okay, so there are very different notions of what constitutes to be scientific. And of course, it's become very relevant, say, in the Russian context recently among psychologists, where those with a certain training want to say that, well, our practice is scientifically based, and all those people who appear on television and advise disturbed children who know nothing are unscientific. So it can have very sharp political, social implications to decide where to use this word, how to use it. Now, that's the first part of the history. Does anybody want to say something? I'm too fast. I'm trying to slow down, but it's...
What is the final conclusion about
expression deriving from a television show. This is the $64,000 question. That is it or is it not? And I now want to explain the context of that question, precisely that question, is it or is it not? And to answer your question, we have to understand the historical change that happened in the English language in the last part of the 19th century. And this change happens from about earlier 18th century, of course it's a science. No? Of course it's a science. If it's grounded in first principles. Well, the whole century people would have agreed that language should, maybe it hasn't achieved its status, but it should and can be a science. So, same with anthropology, same with theology, same with, what would be another example? There's psychology, because they are systematic disciplines, they are sciences. This changes in the English language from about 1870. And it is very interesting. I'll, in a minute, try and give some suggestions why there is a change. But science gradually comes to mean natural science. That is to mean science founded on the physical sciences or forms of knowledge that imitate, try and adopt the methods and concepts of the physical sciences. This is very important because it separates the English-speaking world from the rest of continental European languages. And it troubles you when you have to write in English because you do not know how to describe yourselves because you're not physicists. But you want to say that you're scientists. You cannot do this in English so easily. Not now. That is, you could say that the English language becomes corrupted. It starts to restrict the usage of science to certain forms of knowledge, and they are the forms of knowledge which are those of the physical sciences or sciences which claim to be based upon the physical sciences, biology, or whatever. Economics, some people claim. Management science, some people claim. But the word science is borrowed to indicate that a field or a discipline is comparable to a physical science. Now, this is well known, that this peculiar use of English. It is well known, but it disturbs people. They don't know what to do with it. It seems to me. Now, the first indications of using science to be natural science date from about the 1860s. And note that what it does is transfer the truth status of knowledge to the physical sciences. They become the model sciences of highest status. And other forms of knowledge, if they wish to have status, need in English language, need in some way to demonstrate their basis in or foundations on the physical sciences. And they need to adopt the methods of the physical sciences, quantification above all. That is the method that becomes demonstrative of scientific status, is to quantify. Economics is the most dramatic example, it seems to me. Now, this transfer of usage to the natural sciences is partly built on earlier classifications of knowledge associated with the Enlightenment, 18th century, and especially Auguste Comte, who organized the sciences in a hierarchy of demonstrated truth, with, of course, the mathematical, physical sciences at the top, and with no place for theology. And in effect, this hierarchical conception of science, that there are some very good sciences, some quite good ones, and a lot of rather weak ones, and some non-sciences, gets taken over by the English language. Hence your question, philology. Where does it fit in this hierarchy? Is it physical science? No. Is it quantified? Well, some people claim that it could be. There are attempts to formalize it. The formalist Jacobson, for example, turned to logic as a way to attempt to turn philology, study of language, into a scientific form by giving it a logical structure. So that this is my second point, that once you arrange sciences in a hierarchy, you are left with a large group of disciplines: philology, anthropology, psychology, social science, political science, which do not have clear status. And hence, the history of these sciences is a history of their claims to be sciences, and often of people's rejection of those claims. I think I'm correct in saying that the Russian Academy of Sciences has never had a full member who's a psychologist. It's not, for the Russian Academy of Sciences, it's not the real thing.
Philologists. Some philologists.
Exactly, this is the interesting difference. In Russia, you have philologists and you have philosophers in the Academy of Sciences. In England, you have a complete separation between two academies. You have the Royal Society of London, which is science, and you have the British Academy, which is the humanities. Interesting. And that reflects the language. The people in the British Academy, however eminent, like Isaac Berlin, would never describe himself as a scientist. Absolutely never. I'm very interested in the case of history. Is it or is it not a science? In English, no. But historians have extremely rigorous ways of testing evidence, of colligating facts, bringing facts together, trying to bring those facts into some kind of order. But the difference is usually said to be that history does not achieve general laws. And of course, hence the interest of historical materialism, and in that it was the claim to turn history into a science of comparable standing to the physical sciences by colligating facts and demonstrating general laws. And the failure of historical materialism as such a demonstrated science is taken by most English speakers to show that you can't do this with history. And most English speakers are extremely skeptical of the kind of historical attempts they find in Spengler or Gumilev or others to create general laws of history. These are not admired in the West, in the English-speaking world, such arguments. Now, that is, and people would say history is not a science. You cannot achieve the same kind of knowledge. But I would want to say that within these fields, history, philology, anthropology, social science, there may well be very rigorous methods and very clear ways for separating what is good social science, what is good psychology, good anthropology from bad. But they may not be the methods of the natural sciences. That is, I personally want to turn to the tradition of Eco and say that there are other forms of science than those which are modeled on the physical sciences. But to make that argument in English, I have to be very careful, because if I use the word science, people hear physical science. Okay. So very foggy fields, which I group together as the human sciences, anthropology, anthropology, philology, linguistics, history. For these fields, it has been a recurrent, a continuously repeated debate to say what their status as sciences is. And it constitutes part of what those fields are, that debate. So I said Lacan in psychoanalysis. For American psychologists, it's neuropsychology. That's the real thing, real science. Now, so the second point I want to make is that just as the restriction of the use of word science to natural science has effects on other disciplines, it has an effect on philosophy. Where is philosophy in the scheme of things? And very straightforwardly in the English language, nobody would call philosophy a science, with the exception of those philosophers who specifically attempted to turn it into a science, that is, the logical positivists. There has been an attempt by Russell and more by the logical positivists of the Vienna School to make philosophy a science. And it is, to my mind, extremely important that that very serious, extremely sophisticated attempt failed. Very important historical fact. From the 1960s, it was clear that logical positivism had no future. So where is philosophy? Well, note how the Germans do not have this problem. They have Wissenschaft. And they do separate, of course, Naturwissenschaft and Geisteswissenschaft. The sciences of the physical world and the sciences of culture, language, the human spirit. So the problem, though of course there'll be large debate about the relationship in sciences in German language, with Dilthey and Cassirer and others, there's not the same sharp division between science and non-science. Both are Wissenschaft. Philology, for Germans, is certainly a science, certainly a Wissenschaft. For most traditionally in Germany. And this leads the question, what is the relationship between philosophical knowledge and scientific knowledge? Is it possible to separate the two, or is the relationship between them intensely confused? For a long time in the English-speaking world in the 20th century, philosophers thought they could be sharply separated. There were scientific statements about the world, and there were philosophical statements about concepts and the use of language. Separate. This division lasted until the 1980s. And from that time it has been questioned by a large number of philosophers interested in neuroscience. There is, in the philosophy of mind, there is an attempt to say that the science needs philosophy and the philosophy needs the science. If we are to understand the problems of mind, consciousness, memory, perception, emotion. Some philosophers say, no, that's wrong, we must keep separate philosophical statements and empirical statements about the world. But there are influential philosophers, whom the best known is Daniel Dennett, who say that, no, we must bring the two together. The neuroscience, the science of the brain, and the philosophy of the mind. And I find these questions very difficult, and I'm in complete confusion about the relationship between scientific statements and philosophical statements, and I think a lot of other people are too. That is not a personal problem. It's a shared, it seems to be a major problem of contemporary philosophy, is to be clearer about that relationship. This is my impression. Now, why did the change happen in the English-speaking world? It happens in Great Britain and in the United States, in the English-speaking world generally. Why did the word science become narrower? Well, this is interestingly, I haven't found much good historical discussion of this. There's a wonderful monograph to be written about this question. So if somebody wants to write a good monograph. Firstly, let me say something about the context, the 19th century, the background. What is happening in science in the 19th century? And there is a very important social change which creates what we recognize as modern science, which is the process of creating disciplines in the modern sense. Physics, chemistry, physiology, zoology, botany, and later biochemistry, and on the other hand, philology, history, classical studies, all become socially organized disciplines in the modern sense, with departments and universities, with professors who are leaders who train students in the techniques of study of the particular area. That is the organisation of the modern university until very recently. You have to qualify everything very recently. Everything is consisted of the creation of disciplines. You ask people, what do you do as a scientist? They say, well, I'm a biologist. I'm a philologist. What do they mean? They mean that I trained within a particular social institution structured around a particular expertise, which I have acquired. It's like, of course, this training goes back to the three professions of the medieval period in law, in medicine, and in theology, where there was similar kind of professional training. But in the 19th century, that kind of professional training extends into the sciences. And it's in this context that the words natural and moral philosophy gradually disappear to be replaced by reference to the sciences. When Adam Smith, famous economist at the University of Glasgow, taught moral philosophy in the mid-18th century, he taught history of language, he taught law, he taught what we would call economics, he taught history, he taught moral philosophy. He didn't have discipline in the modern sense. You may think all the better for it, but and some people have even referred to the early 19th century as a period of the second scientific revolution, because it recreates the study of the world in terms of disciplines in the way that we understand them. And in that context, English-speaking people start to refer to the humanities disciplines, which I'll talk about next week, and the science disciplines, meaning the natural science disciplines. And of course, that does not happen in Russia, does not happen in Germany. This shift towards disciplines is a shift away from amateur to professional. Instead of people being able to read at home and become chemists, they have to study, they have to train with a professor, they have to get a PhD. That is, to be a scientist becomes something that you have to achieve through study. That is, it acquires social status. And that social status separates ordinary people who might look for a telescope at the moon from the astronomer who's trained in the understanding of mathematical astrophysics, use of the spectrometer, and so on. In the German-speaking world, the discipline involves having the discipline to show show the foundations on which your argument is made. Traditional German theses have a first chapter, which is conceptual. This is the foundations for what follows. A logical argument. And it is very important that the fields which were shown, it appeared could be shown to have sound foundations, were the physical sciences. The mid-19th century sees the founding of the modern concept of energy, conservation of energy principles, and it sees the theory of evolution. That is, both the physical and biological sciences are given what appear to be fundamental foundations in the mid-19th century. And then you can turn to philosophy and say, well, what fundamental foundations is philosophy achieved? Hegel. By 1840, everybody's in revolt against Hegel. What after that? That is, there's a shift of status in the university away from philosophy towards the natural sciences. And in Germany, not just the natural sciences, but also philology, classics, the humanistic sciences. But towards shifting status away from general knowledge to disciplinary knowledge. It's very important. And it became a commonplace occasion for people to say, well, students would choose to study physiology, not philosophy. Why? Physiology has shown progress, philosophy has not, in the second half of the 19th century. And those sciences, which had most obviously demonstrated progress, and they demonstrated spectacular progress in the 19th century, the sciences of physics, the unification of the energy principles, and then, of course, in the early 20th century, the transformation of the study of energy into the study of atomic phenomena. Spectacular progress in philosophy. I'm not trying to make a critical point, but you can understand the social impact of this kind of.
How would you measure progress in philosophy?
How
could you measure progress in philosophy?
Well, this is, of course, the kind of answer that philosophers start to develop. But the fact is that early philosophers had indeed claimed to make progress. Kant certainly had. Hegel certainly had. They become more modest later and start to make precisely the move that you're suggesting. How do we measure progress in philosophy? It becomes a very relevant question in the modern contemporary world, because when bureaucrats want to measure achievement, how do they measure achievement in philosophy? Well, they do stupid things, they count citations. Now, the further argument that we need to note is that certainly history, philology, anthropology, and later psychology develop as disciplines, certainly, and sometimes extremely rigorous. Training in philology was, of course, fantastically demanding in German universities. People became extremely talented in many languages. But did the philologists achieve unity of knowledge? That is, physicists do, so it appears, and the philologists do not. And the historians certainly do not. Weber has one view about historical materialism, and the Marxists, like Arnold and others, have completely different views about historical materialism. That is, the public perceives an achievement of unity among the natural scientists and perceives a lack of unity among other disciplines. And hence, the word science is increasingly used to about those disciplines which appear to have achieved a unity. The physical sciences, not the humanistic sciences. fact physical sciences achieve unity is another matter. When you look closely, it's not at all as clear-cut as that. But the public, we're talking about images, and hence the way the words are used. The imaging in natural science is that it achieves a degree of success which is visible in unity. And of course, it's also visible in technology. It may well be that it's technology that, above everything else, persuades people that the physical sciences have the highest status because of the way it affects ordinary life, transforms ordinary people's lives. Whether or not much of the technology is based upon science is another matter again, but we're talking about historical perceptions. Now, we're getting on. I must stop very soon. Let me just make a suggestion about why the change happens. I mean, discipline change happened in Germany, but restricted usage happens in the English-speaking world. Why? And I think you have to turn to the empiricist tradition in Great Britain. That is from the 17th century. English language is different. University teaching, higher education is different because it emphasizes the demonstration involves showing correspondence between what you say and the world. Whereas with Descartes, the demonstration involves clarifying the foundations of mechanics and basing those on the first principles of philosophy. So, I want to say that it is the physical sciences which can show that their statements correspond to the world. They appear to be able to demonstrate empirically success. And hence, within a culture which is empiricist, it is not surprising that they have higher status. And it's in that context that people become willing to say that the real science is physical science, and the other sciences which don't achieve the same discipline of making correspondence statements with the world are lesser status and are not real sciences. And this is very, I can't go into this now, but we here touch upon a very significant part of British culture. For many English-speaking people, to say that something's demonstrated by showing it corresponds to the world is common sense. And all these arguments about it being based upon sound first principles are what French philosophers do. They're not common sense. And there is a real wealth of attachment, and it's connected with the political settlement in Britain, the liberal political settlement in Britain, to empiricist statements. What makes a statement certain? It is that it corresponds to the world. Of course, Locke is the classic source for this argument in philosophy. And the tradition after Locke is deeply influential. Philosophy, and English language philosophy, is concerned with epistemology, theory of knowledge, with making judgments about whether or not something is securely known or not. And you find in Russia or in France, philosophers who say, well, I'm not interested in epistemology, it doesn't matter. Metaphysics, ethics is important, but not epistemology. In the English-speaking world, that is unacceptable because of the modern empiricist tradition. No, I of course generalize, but okay, I'm going to stop. I talked long enough. I have a few comments. Just the last comment. Yes, let me come to my conclusion. My conclusion is practical. That is, what words are you to use when you represent your own occupations in the English-speaking world? In particular, what language do you use when you fill out a grant form? Or you wish to satisfy the demands of bureaucracies who are using the English language? If, as philosophers, you say you are scientists, it looks very strange. will say, the bureaucrat will say, Russians, they're not scientists. That is, you may do yourself an injustice. And you need to say that you are philosophers, or ethicists, or what it is, or psychologists, but you need to show that you have a discipline. And the easiest word for that is to say that you are a trained researcher or an academic, a qualified academic, and you give your qualifications. Because if you say that you are a scientist, it will not be understood, it seems to me. And I think that this is a very interesting practical implication of the language.
Could be used?
Scholar, certainly scholar, but you have to make clear that you belong to an institution, that you're not like I am. I would describe myself as an independent scholar. It doesn't get grants.
Academic scholar.
No, I would call myself an independent one, because I work outside of an institution. But it's not high status. You have to find ways to represent the disciplinary standing that you have within your field of expertise, and not think that describing yourself as a scientist will do the work. It will not do the work. Did you agree with that?